The Trimmed Lamp by O. Henry. Of course, there are two sides to the question. Let us look at the other. We often hear shopgirls spoken of. No such persons exist. There are girls who work in shops. They make their living that way. But why turn their occupation into an adjective? Let us be fair. We do not refer to the girls who live on Fifth Avenue as marriage girls. Lou and Nancy were chums. They came to the big city to find work because there was not enough to eat at their homes to go around. Nancy was 19. Lou was 20. Both were pretty, active, country girls who had no ambition to go on the stage. The little cherub that sits up aloft guided them to a cheap and respectable boarding house. Both found positions and became wage earners. They remained chums. It is at the end of 6 months that I would beg you to step forward and be introduced to them. Meddlesome reader, my lady friends, Miss Nancy and Miss Lou. While you are shaking hands, please take notice cautiously of their attire. Yes, cautiously. For they are as quick to resent a stare as a lady in a box at the horse show is. Lou is a piecework ironer in a hand laundry. She is clothed in a badly fitting purple dress, and her hat plume is 4 inches too long. But her ermine muff and scarf cost $25, and its fellow beast will be ticketed in the windows at $7.98 before the season is over. Her cheeks are pink, and her light blue eyes bright. Contentment radiates from her. Nancy you would call a shop girl because you have the habit. There is no type, but a perverse generation is always seeking a type. So this is what the type should be. She has the high-ratted pompadour and the exaggerated straight front. Her skirt is shoddy, but has the correct flare. No furs protect her against the bitter spring air, but she wears her short broadcloth jacket as jauntily as though it were Persian lamb. On her face and in her eyes, remorseless type-seeker, is the typical shopgirl expression. It is a look of silent but contemptuous revolt against cheated womanhood, of sad prophecy of the vengeance to come. When she laughs her loudest, the look is still there. The same look can be seen in the eyes of Russian peasants, and those of us left will see it someday on Gabriel's face when he comes to blow us up. It is a look that should wither and abash man, but he has been known to smirk at it and offer flowers with a string tied to them. Now lift your hat and come away, while you receive Lou's cheery, "See you again," and the sardonic, sweet smile of Nancy that seems, somehow, to miss you and go fluttering like a white moth up over the housetops to the stars. The two waited on the corner for Dan. Dan was Lou's steady company. Faithful? Well, he was on hand when Mary would have had to hire a dozen subpoena servers to find her lamb. "Ain't you cold, Nance?" said Lou. "Say, what a chump you are for working in that old store for $8 a week. I made $8.50 last week. Of course, ironing ain't as swell work as selling lace behind a counter, but it pays. None of us ironers make less than $10. And I don't know that it's any less respectful work, either." "You can have it," said Nancy with uplifted nose. "I'll take my 8 a week in hall bedroom. I like to be among nice things and swell people. And look what a chance I've got. Why, one of our glove girls married a Pittsburgh steelmaker or blacksmith or something the other day worth $1 million. I'll catch a swell myself sometime. I ain't bragging on my looks or anything, but I'll take my chances where there's big prizes offered. What show would a girl have in a laundry?" "Why, that's where I met Dan," said Lou triumphantly. "He came in for his Sunday shirt and collars and saw me at the first board, ironing. We all try to get to work at the first board. Ella McGinnis was sick that day, and I had her place. He said he noticed my arms first, how round and white they was. I had my sleeves rolled up. Some nice fellows come into laundries. You can tell 'em by their bringing their clothes in suitcases and turning in the door sharp and sudden." "How can you wear a waist like that, Lou?" said Nancy, gazing down at the offending article with sweet scorn in her heavy-lidded eyes. "It shows fierce taste." "This waist?" cried Lou, with wide-eyed indignation. "Why, I paid $16 for this waist. It's worth $25. A woman left it to be laundered and never called for it. The boss sold it to me. It's got yards and yards of hand embroidery on it. Better talk about that ugly, plain thing you've got on." "This ugly, plain thing," said Nancy calmly, "was copied from one that Mrs. Van Alstyne Fisher was wearing. The girls say her bill in the store last year was $12,000. I made mine myself. It cost me $1.50. 10 feet away, you couldn't tell it from hers. Oh, well, said Lou good-naturedly. If you want to starve and put on airs, go ahead. But I'll take my job and good wages. And after hours, give me something as fancy and attractive to wear as I am able to buy. But just then Dan came, a serious young man with a ready-made necktie, who had escaped the city's brand of frivolity, an electrician earning $30 per week, who looked upon Lou with the sad eyes of Romeo, and thought her embroidered waist a web in which any fly should delight to be caught. My friend, Mr. Owen, shake hands with Miss Danforth, said Lou. I'm mighty glad to know you, Miss Danforth, said Dan with outstretched hand. I've heard Lou speak of you so often. Thanks, said Nancy, touching his fingers with the tips of her cool ones. I've heard her mention you a few times. Lou giggled. Did you get that handshake from Mrs. Van Alstyne Fisher, Nance? She asked. If I did, you can feel safe in copying it, said Nancy. Oh, I couldn't use it at all. It's too stylish for me. It's intended to set off diamond rings. That high shake is. Wait till I get a few, and then I'll try it. Learn it first, said Nancy wisely, and you'll be more likely to get the rings. Now, to settle this argument, said Dan, with his ready, cheerful smile, let me make a proposition. As I can't take both of you up to Tiffany's and do the right thing, what do you say to a little vaudeville? I've got the rickets. How about looking at stage diamonds, since we can't shake hands with the real sparklers? The faithful squire took his place close to the curb. Lou next, a little peacocky in her bright and pretty clothes. Nancy on the inside, slender and soberly clothed as the sparrow, but with the true Van Alstyne Fisher walk. Thus they set out for their evening's moderate diversion. I do not suppose that many look upon a great department store as an educational institution, but the one in which Nancy worked was something like that to her. She was surrounded by beautiful things that breathed of taste and refinement. If you live in an atmosphere of luxury, luxury is yours whether your money pays for it or another's. The people she served were mostly women whose dress, manners, and position in the social world were quoted as criterions. From them Nancy began to take toll, the best from each according to her view. From one she would copy and practice a gesture, from another an eloquent lifting of an eyebrow, from others a manner of walking, of carrying a purse, of smiling, of greeting a friend, of addressing inferiors in station. From her best beloved model, Mrs. Van Alstyne Fisher, she made requisition for that excellent thing, a soft, low voice as clear as silver and as perfect in articulation as the notes of a thrush. Suffused in the aura of this high social refinement and good breeding, it was impossible for her to escape a deeper effect of it. As good habits are said to be better than good principles, so, perhaps, good manners are better than good habits. The teachings of your parents may not keep alive your New England conscience, but if you sit on a straight-back chair and repeat the words prisms and pilgrims 40 times, the devil will flee from you. And when Nancy spoke in the Van Alstyne Fisher tones, she felt the thrill of unbelief through her very bones. There was another source of learning in the great departmental school. Whenever you see 3 or 4 shopgirls gather in a bunch and jingle their wire bracelets as an accompaniment to apparently frivolous conversation, do not think that they are there for the purpose of criticizing the way Ethel does her back hair. The meeting may lack the dignity of the deliberative bodies of man, but it has all the importance of the occasion on which Eve and her first daughter first put their heads together to make Adam understand his proper place in the household. It is woman's conference for common defense and exchange of strategical theories of attack and repulse upon and against the world, which is a stage, and man, its audience, who persists in throwing bouquets thereupon. Woman, the most helpless of the young of any animal, with the fawn's grace but without its fleetness, with the bird's beauty but without its power of flight, with the honeybee's burden of sweetness but without its let's drop that simile, some of us may have been stung. During this council of war they pass weapons one to another, and exchange stratagems that each has devised and formulated out of the tactics of life. I says to him, says Sadie, ain't you the fresh thing? Who do you suppose I am, to be addressing such a remark to me? And what do you think he says back to me? The heads, brown, black, flaxen, red, and yellow bob together. The answer is given, and the parry to the thrust is decided upon, to be used by each thereafter in passages at arms with the common enemy, man. Thus Nancy learned the art of defense, and to women successful defense means victory. The curriculum of a department store is a wide one. Perhaps no other college could have fitted her as well for her life's ambition, the drawing of a matrimonial prize. Her station in the store was a favored one. The music room was near enough for her to hear and become familiar with the works of the best composers, least to acquire the familiarity that passed for appreciation in the social world in which she was vaguely trying to set a tentative and aspiring foot. She absorbed the educating influence of art wares, of costly and dainty fabrics, of adornments that are almost culture to women. The other girls soon became aware of Nancy's ambition. "Here comes your millionaire, Nancy," they would call to her whenever any man who looked the role approached her counter. It got to be a habit of men, who were hanging about while their womenfolk were shopping, to stroll over to the handkerchief counter and dawdle over the cambric squares. Nancy's imitation high-bred air and genuine dainty beauty was what attracted. Many men thus came to display their graces before her. Some of them may have been millionaires. Others were certainly no more than their sedulous apes. Nancy learned to discriminate. There was a window at the end of the handkerchief counter, and she could see the rows of vehicles waiting for the shoppers in the street below. She looked and perceived that automobiles differ as well as do their owners. Once a fascinating gentleman bought 4 dozen handkerchiefs and wooed her across the counter with a King Cophetua air. When he had gone, one of the girls said, "What's wrong, Nance, that you didn't warm up to that fellow? He looks the swell article, all right, to me." "Him?" said Nancy, with her coolest, sweetest, most impersonal Van Alstyne Fisher smile. "Not for mine. I saw him drive up outside. A 12 HP machine and an Irish chauffeur. And you saw what kind of handkerchiefs he bought, silk. And he's got dactylus on him. Give me the real thing or nothing, if you please." 2 of the most refined women in the store, a forelady and a cashier, had a few swell gentlemen friends, with whom they now and then dined. Once they included Nancy in an invitation. The dinner took place in a spectacular cafe whose tables are engaged for New Year's Eve a year in advance. There were 2 gentlemen friends, one without any hair on his head, high living ungrew it, and we can prove it, the other a young man whose worth and sophistication he impressed upon you in 2 convincing ways. He swore that all the wine was corked, and he wore diamond cuff buttons. This young man perceived irresistible excellencies in Nancy. His taste ran to shop girls, and here was one that added the voice and manners of his high social world to the franker charms of her own caste. So, on the following day, he appeared in the store and made her a serious proposal of marriage over a box of hem-stitched, grass-bleached Irish linens. Nancy declined. A brown pompadour 10 feet away had been using her eyes and ears. When the rejected suitor had gone, she heaped carboys of upbraidings and horror upon Nancy's head. "What a terrible little fool you are. That fellow's a millionaire. He's a nephew of old Van Skittles himself. And he was talking on the level, too. Have you gone crazy, Nance?" "Have I?" said Nancy. "I didn't take him, did I? He isn't a millionaire so hard that you could notice it. Anyhow, his family only allows him $20,000 a year to spend. The bald-headed fellow was guying him about it the other night at supper." The brown pompadour came nearer and narrowed her eyes. "Say, what do you want?" she inquired, in a voice hoarse for lack of chewing gum. "Ain't that enough for you? Do you want to be a Mormon and marry Rockefeller and Gladstone Dowie and the King of Spain and the whole bunch? Ain't $20,000 a year good enough for you?" Nancy flushed a little under the level gaze of the black, shallow eyes. "It wasn't altogether the money, Carrie," she explained. "His friend caught him in a rank lie the other night at dinner. It was about some girl he said he hadn't been to the theater with. Well, I can't stand a liar. Put everything together, I don't like him, and that settles it. When I sell out, it's not going to be on any bargain day. I've got to have something that sits up in a chair like a man, anyhow. Yes, I'm looking out for a catch, but it's got to be able to do something more than make a noise like a toy bank." "The physiopathic ward for yours," said the brown pompadour, walking away. These high ideas, if not ideals, Nancy continued to cultivate on $8 per week. She bivouacked on the trail of the great unknown catch, eating her dry bread and tightening her belt day by day. On her face was the faint, soldierly, sweet, grim smile of the preordained manhunter. The store was her forest, and many times she raised her rifle at game that seemed broad-antlered and big, but always some deep unerring instinct perhaps of the huntress, perhaps of the woman made her hold her fire and take up the trail again. Lou flourished in the laundry. Out of her $18.50 per week, she paid $6 for her room and board. The rest went mainly for clothes. Her opportunities for bettering her taste and manners were few compared with Nancy's. In the steaming laundry there was nothing but work, work and her thoughts of the evening pleasures to come. Many costly and showy fabrics passed under her iron, and it may be that her growing fondness for dress was thus transmitted to her through the conducting metal. When the day's work was over, Dan awaited her outside, her faithful shadow in whatever light she stood. Sometimes he cast an honest and troubled glance at Lou's clothes that increased in conspicuity rather than in style, but this was no disloyalty. He deprecated the attention they called to her in the streets. And Lou was no less faithful to her chum. There was a law that Nancy should go with them on whatsoever outings they might take. Dan bore the extra burden heartily and in good cheer. It might be said that Lou furnished the color, Nancy the tone, and Dan the weight of the distraction-seeking trio. The escort, in his neat but obviously ready-made suit, his ready-made tie and unfailing, genial, ready-made wit never startled or clashed. He was of that good kind that you are likely to forget while they are present, but remember distinctly after they are gone. To Nancy's superior taste the flavor of these ready-made pleasures was sometimes a little bitter, but she was young, and youth is a gourmand when it cannot be a gourmet. Dan is always wanting me to marry him right away, Lou told her once. But why should I? I'm independent. I can do as I please with the money I earn. And he never would agree for me to keep on working afterward and say, Nance, what do you want to stick to that old store for, and half starve and half dress yourself? I could get you a place in the laundry right now if you'd come. It seems to me that you could afford to be a little less stuck up if you could make a good deal more money. I don't think I'm stuck up, Lou, said Nancy, but I'd rather live on half rations and stay where I am. I suppose I've got the habit. It's the chance that I want. I don't expect to be always behind a counter. I'm learning something new every day. I'm right up against refined and rich people all the time, even if I do only wait on them. And I'm not missing any pointers that I see passing around. Caught your millionaire yet? Asked Lou with her teasing laugh. I haven't selected one yet, answered Nancy. I've been looking them over. Goodness, the idea of picking over him. Don't you ever let one get by you, Nance, even if he's a few dollars shy. But of course you're joking. Millionaires don't think about working girls like us. It might be better for them if they did, said Nancy with cool wisdom. Some of us could teach them how to take care of their money. If one was to speak to me, laughed Lou, I know I'd have a duck fit. That's because you don't know any. The only difference between swells and other people is you have to watch 'em closer. Don't you think that red silk lining is just a little bit too bright for that coat, Lou? Lou looked at the plain, dull olive jacket of her friend. Well, no I don't, but it may seem so beside that faded-looking thing you've got on. This jacket, said Nancy complacently, has exactly the cut and fit of one that Mrs. Van Alstyne Fisher was wearing the other day. The material cost me $3.98. I suppose hers cost about $100. More. Oh, well, said Lou lightly, it don't strike me as millionaire bait. Shouldn't wonder if I catch one before you do, anyway. Truly, it would have taken a philosopher to decide upon the values of the theories held by the two friends. Lou, lacking that certain pride and fastidiousness that keeps stores and desks filled with girls working for the barest living, thumped away gaily with her iron in the noisy and stifling laundry. Her wages supported her even beyond the point of comfort, so that her dress profited until sometimes she cast a sidelong glance of impatience at the neat but inelegant apparel of Dandan, the constant, the immutable, the undeviating. As for Nancy, her case was one of tens of thousands. Silk and jewels and laces and ornaments, and the perfume and music of the fine world of good breeding and taste, these were made for woman. They are her equitable portion. Let her keep near them if they are a part of life to her. and if she will. She is no traitor to herself, as Esau was. For she keeps his birthright, and the pottage she earns is often very scant. In this atmosphere Nancy belonged, and she throve in it and ate her frugal meals and schemed over her cheap dresses with a determined and contented mind. She already knew woman, and she was studying man, the animal, both as to his habits and eligibility. Someday she would bring down the game that she wanted. But she promised herself it would be what seemed to her the biggest and the best, and nothing smaller. Thus she kept her lamp trimmed and burning to receive the bridegroom when he should come. But another lesson she learned, perhaps unconsciously. Her standard of values began to shift and change. Sometimes the dollar mark grew blurred in her mind's eye and shaped itself into letters that spelled such words as truth and honor, and now and then just kindness. Let us make a likeness of one who hunts the moose or elk in some mighty wood. He sees a little dell, mossy and embowered, where a rill trickles, babbling to him of rest and comfort. At these times the spear of Nimrod himself grows blunt. So, Nancy wondered sometimes if Persian lamb was always quoted at its market value by the hearts that it covered. One Thursday evening Nancy left the store and turned across 6th Avenue westward to the laundry. She was expected to go with Lou and Dan to a musical comedy. Dan was just coming out of the laundry when she arrived. There was a queer, strained look on his face. "I thought I would drop around to see if they had heard from her," he said. "Heard from who?" asked Nancy. "Isn't Lou there?" "I thought you knew," said Dan. "She hasn't been here or at the house where she lived since Monday. She moved all her things from there. She told one of the girls in the laundry she might be going to Europe." "Hasn't anybody seen her anywhere?" asked Nancy. Dan looked at her with his jaws set grimly and a steely gleam in his steady gray eyes. "They told me in the laundry," he said harshly, "that they saw her pass yesterday in an automobile. With one of the millionaires, I suppose, that you and Lou were forever busying your brains about." For the first time Nancy quailed before a man. She laid her hand that trembled slightly on Dan's sleeve. "You've no right to say such a thing to me, Dan, as if I had anything to do with it." "I didn't mean it that way," said Dan, softening. He fumbled in his vest pocket. "I've got the tickets for the show tonight," he said, with a gallant show of lightness. "If you—" Nancy admired pluck whenever she saw it. "I'll go with you, Dan," she said. 3 months went by before Nancy saw Lou again. At twilight one evening the shopgirl was hurrying home along the border of a little quiet park. She heard her name called and wheeled about in time to catch Lou rushing into her arms. After the first embrace they drew their heads back as serpents do, ready to attack or to charm, with 1,000 questions trembling on their swift tongues. And then Nancy noticed that prosperity had descended upon Lou, manifesting itself in costly furs, flashing gems, and creations of the tailor's art. "You little fool!" cried Lou, loudly and affectionately. "I see you are still working in that store, and as shabby as ever. And how about that big catch you were going to make nothing doing yet, I suppose?" And then Lou looked and saw that something better than prosperity had descended upon Nancy, something that shone brighter than gems in her eyes and redder than a rose in her cheeks, and that danced like electricity anxious to be loosed from the tip of her tongue. "Yes, I'm still in the store," said Nancy, "but I'm going to leave it next week. I've made my catch the biggest catch in the world. You won't mind now, Lou, will you? I'm going to be married to Dan. He's my Dan now, why, Lou?" Around the corner of the park strolled one of those new crop, smooth-faced young policemen that are making the force more endurable, at least to the eye. He saw a woman with an expensive fur coat and diamond-ringed hands crouching down against the iron fence of the park, sobbing turbulently, while a slender, plainly dressed working girl leaned close, trying to console her. But the Gibsonian cop, being of the new order, passed on, pretending not to notice, for he was wise enough to know that these matters are beyond help so far as the power he represents is concerned, though he rapped the pavement with his nightstick till the sound goes up to the furthermost stars. The third ingredient, by O. Henry. The so-called Vallambrosa Apartment-House is not an apartment house. It is composed of 2 old-fashioned, brownstone front residences welded into one. The parlor floor of one side is gay with the wraps and headgear of a modiste. The other is lugubrious with the sophistical promises and grisly display of a painless dentist. You may have a room there for $2 a week, or you may have one for $20. Among the Vallambrosas roomers are stenographers, musicians, brokers, shopgirls, space rate writers, art students, wiretappers, and other people who lean far over the banister rail when the doorbell rings. This treatise shall have to do with but two of the Vallambrosians, though meaning no disrespect to the others. At 6 o'clock one afternoon, Hetty Pepper came back to her third-floor rear $3.50 room in the Vallambrosa with her nose and chin more sharply pointed than usual. To be discharged from the department store where you have been working for years, and with only 15 cents in your purse, does have a tendency to make your features appear more finely chiseled. And now for Hetty's thumbnail biography, while she climbs the 2 flights of stairs. She walked into the biggest store one morning 4 years before with 75 other girls, applying for a job behind the waste department counter. The phalanx of wage earners formed a bewildering scene of beauty, carrying a total mass of blonde hair sufficient to have justified the horseback gallops of 100 Lady Godivas. The capable, cool-eyed, impersonal, young, bald-headed man whose task it was to engage 6 of the contestants was aware of a feeling of suffocation as if he were drowning in a sea of frangipani, while white clouds, hand-embroidered, floated about him, and then a sail hove in sight. Hetty Pepper, homely of countenance, with small, contemptuous, green eyes and chocolate-colored hair, dressed in a suit of plain burlap and a common-sense hat, stood before him with every one of her 29 years of life unmistakably in sight. "You're on!" shouted the bald-headed young man, and was saved. And that is how Hetty came to be employed in the biggest store. The story of her rise to an $8 a week salary is the combined stories of Hercules, Joan of Arc, Una, Job, and Little Red Riding Hood. You shall not learn from me the salary that was paid her as a beginner. There is a sentiment growing about such things, and I want no millionaire store proprietors climbing the fire escape of my tenement house to throw dynamite bombs into my skylight boudoir. The story of Hetty's discharge from the biggest store is so nearly a repetition of her engagement as to be monotonous. In each department of the store there is an omniscient, omnipresent, and omnivorous person carrying always a mileage book and a red necktie, and referred to as a buyer. The destinies of the girls in his department who live on, see Bureau of Vital Statistics, so much per week are in his hands. This particular buyer was a capable, cool-eyed, impersonal, young, bald-headed man. As he walked along the aisles of his department, life seemed to be sailing on a sea of frangipani, while white clouds, machine-embroidered, floated around him. Too many sweets bring surfeit. He looked upon Hetty Pepper's homely countenance, emerald eyes, and chocolate-colored hair as a welcome oasis of green in a desert of cloying beauty. In a quiet angle of a counter, he pinched her arm kindly, 3 inches above the elbow. She slapped him 3 feet away with one good blow of her muscular, and not especially lily, white right. So, now you know why Hetty Pepper came to leave the biggest store at 30 minutes' notice, with 1 dime and a nickel in her purse. This morning's quotations list the price of rib beef at 6 cents per butcher's pound, but on the day that Hetty was released by the BS, the price was 7.5 cents. That fact is what makes this story possible. Otherwise, the extra 4 cents would have. But the plot of nearly all the good stories in the world is concerned with shorts who were unable to cover, so you can find no fault with this one. Hetty mounted with her rib beef to her $3.50 third floor back, 1 hot, savory beef stew for supper, a night's good sleep, and she would be fit in the morning to apply again for the tasks of Hercules, Joan of Arc, Una, Job, and Little Red Riding Hood. In her room she got the graniteware stew pan out of the 2x4-foot china earthenware closet and began to dig down in a rat's nest of paper bags for the potatoes and onions. She came out with her nose and chin just a little sharper pointed. There was neither a potato nor an onion. Now, what kind of a beef stew can you make out of simply beef? You can make oyster soup without oysters, turtle soup without turtles, coffee cake without coffee, but you can't make beef stew without potatoes and onions. But rib beef alone, in an emergency, can make an ordinary pine door look like a wrought iron gambling house portal to the wolf. With salt and pepper and a tablespoonful of flour, first well stirred in a little cold water. 'Twill serve 'tis not so deep as a lobster a la Newburgh, nor so wide as a church festival donut. But 'twill serve. Hetty took her stew pan to the rear of the third-floor hall. According to the advertisements of the Vallambrosa, there was running water to be found there. Between you and me and the water meter, it only ambled or walked through the faucets. But technicalities have no place here. There was also a sink where housekeeping roomers often met to dump their coffee grounds and glare at one another's kimonos. At this sink Hetty found a girl with heavy, gold-brown, artistic hair and plaintive eyes, washing two large Irish potatoes. Hetty knew the Vallambrosa as well as anyone not owning double hextra, magnifying eyes, could compass its mysteries. The kimonos were her encyclopedia, who's what? Her clearinghouse of news, of goers and comers. From a rose-pink kimono edged with Nile green, she had learned that the girl with the potatoes was a miniature painter living in a kind of attic or studio, as they prefer to call it on the top floor. Hetty was not certain in her mind what a miniature was, but it certainly wasn't a house, because house painters, although they wear splashy overalls and poke ladders in your face on the street, are known to indulge in a riotous profusion of food at home. The potato girl was quite slim and small, and handled her potatoes as an old bachelor uncle handles a baby who is cutting teeth. She had a dull shoemaker's knife in her right hand, and she had begun to peel one of the potatoes with it. Hetty addressed her in the punctiliously formal tone of one who intends to be cheerfully familiar with you in the second round. "Beg pardon," she said, "for butting into what's not my business, but if you peel them potatoes you lose out. They're new Bermudas. You want to scrape 'em? Let me show you." She took a potato and the knife and began to demonstrate. "Oh, thank you," breathed the artist. "I didn't know, and I did hate to see the thick peeling go. It seemed such a waste, but I thought they always had to be peeled. When you've got only potatoes to eat, the peelings count, you know." "Say, kid," said Hetty, staying her knife, "you ain't up against it too, are you?" The miniature artist smiled starvely. "I suppose I am. Art, or, at least, the way I interpret it doesn't seem to be much in demand. I have only these potatoes for my dinner, but they aren't so bad boiled and hot, with a little butter and salt." "Child," said Hetty, letting a brief smile soften her rigid features, "fate has sent me and you together. I've had it handed to me in the neck, too, but I've got a chunk of meat in my room as big as a lapdog, and I've done everything to get potatoes except pray for him. Let's me and you bunch our commissary departments and make a stew of him. We'll cook it in my room. If we only had an onion to go in it. Say, kid, you haven't got a couple of pennies that slipped down into the lining of your last winter's sealskin, have you? I could step down to the corner and get one at old Giuseppe's stand. A stew without an onion is worse than a matinee without candy." "You may call me Cecilia," said the artist. "No, I spent my last penny 3 days ago." "Then we'll have to cut the onion out instead of slicing it in," said Hetty. "I'd ask the janitress for one, but I don't want him hep just yet to the fact that I'm pounding the asphalt for another job. But I wish we did have an onion." In the shopgirl's room the two began to prepare their supper. Cecilia's part was to sit on the couch helplessly and beg to be allowed to do something. In the voice of a cooing ring dove, Hetty prepared the rib beef, putting it in cold salted water in the stew pan and setting it on the one-burner gas stove. "I wish we had an onion," said Hetty, as she scraped the two potatoes. On the wall opposite the couch was pinned a flaming, gorgeous advertising picture of one of the new ferry boats of the P.U.F.F. Railroad that had been built to cut down the time between Los Angeles and New York City 1/8 of a minute. Hetty, turning her head during her continuous monologue, saw tears running from her guest's eyes as she gazed on the idealized presentment of the speeding, foam-girdled transport. "Why, say, Cecilia, kid," said Hetty, poising her knife, "is it as bad art as that? I ain't a critic, but I thought it kind of brightened up the room. Of course, a manicure painter could tell it was a bum picture in a minute. I'll take it down if you say so. I wish to the holy St. Potluck we had an onion." But the miniature painter had tumbled down, sobbing, with her nose indenting the hard-woven drapery of the couch. Something was here deeper than the artistic temperament offended at crude lithography. Hetty knew. She had accepted her role long ago. How scant the words with which we try to describe a single quality of a human being. When we reach the abstract, we are lost. The nearer to nature that the babbling of our lips comes, the better do we understand. Figuratively, let us say, some people are bosoms, some are hands, some are heads, some are muscles, some are feet, some are backs for burdens. Hetty was a shoulder. Hers was a sharp, sinewy shoulder. But all her life people had laid their heads upon it, metaphorically or actually, and had left there all or half their troubles. Looking at life anatomically, which is as good a way as any, she was preordained to be a shoulder. There were few truer collarbones anywhere than hers. Hetty was only 33, and she had not yet outlived the little pang that visited her whenever the head of youth and beauty leaned upon her for consolation. But one glance in her mirror always served as an instantaneous painkiller. So she gave one pale look into the crinkly old looking-glass on the wall above the gas stove, turned down the flame a little lower from the bubbling beef and potatoes, went over to the couch, and lifted Cecilia's head to its confessional. "Go on and tell me, honey," she said. "I know now that it ain't art that's worrying you. You met him on a ferry boat, didn't you? Go on, Cecilia, kid, and tell your Aunt Hetty about it." But youth and melancholy must first spin the surplus of sighs and tears that waft and float the bark of romance to its harbor in the delectable isles presently. Through the stringy tendons that formed the bars of the confessional, the penitent, or was it the glorified communicant of the sacred flame, told her story without art or illumination. "It was only 3 days ago. I was coming back on the ferry from Jersey City. Old Mr. Shrum, an art dealer, told me of a rich man in Newark who wanted a miniature of his daughter painted. I went to see him and showed him some of my work. When I told him the price would be $50, he laughed at me like a hyena. He said an enlarged crayon 20 times the size would cost him only $8. I had just enough money to buy my ferry ticket back to New York. I felt as if I didn't want to live another day. I must have looked as I felt, for I saw him on the row of seats opposite me, looking at me as if he understood. He was nice looking, but oh, above everything else, he looked kind. When one is tired or unhappy or hopeless, kindness counts more than anything else. When I got so miserable that I couldn't fight against it any longer, I got up and walked slowly out the rear door of the ferry boat cabin. No one was there, and I slipped quickly over the rail and dropped into the water. Oh, friend Hetty, it was cold, cold. For just one moment I wished I was back in the old Vallambrosa, starving and hoping. And then I got numb and didn't care. And then I felt that somebody else was in the water close by me, holding me up. He had followed me and jumped in to save me. Somebody threw a thing like a big, white donut at us, and he made me put my arms through the hole. Then the ferry boat backed, and they pulled us on board. Oh, Hetty, I was so ashamed of my wickedness in trying to drown myself. And, besides, my hair had all tumbled down and was sopping wet, and I was such a sight. And then some men in blue clothes came around, and he gave them his card, and I heard him tell them he had seen me drop my purse on the edge of the boat outside the rail, and in leaning over to get it I had fallen overboard. And then I remembered having read in the papers that people who try to kill themselves are locked up in cells with people who try to kill other people, and I was afraid. But some ladies on the boat took me downstairs to the furnace room and got me nearly dry and did up my hair. When the boat landed, he came and put me in a cab. He was all dripping himself, but laughed as if he thought it was all a joke. He begged me, but I wouldn't tell him my name nor where I lived. I was so ashamed. "You were a fool, child," said Hetty kindly. "Wait till I turn the light up a bit. I wish to heaven we had an onion." Then he raised his hat, went on Cecilia, and said, "Very well, but I'll find you anyhow. I'm going to claim my rights of salvage." Then he gave money to the cab driver and told him to take me where I wanted to go, and walked away. "What is salvage, Hetty?" "The edge of a piece of goods that ain't hemmed," said the shop girl. "You must have looked pretty well frazzled out to the little hero boy." "It's been 3 days," moaned the miniature painter, "and he hasn't found me yet." "Extend the time," said Hetty. "This is a big town. Think of how many girls he might have to see soaked in water with their hair down before he would recognize you. The stew's getting on fine, but oh, for an onion. I'd even use a piece of garlic if I had it." The beef and potatoes bubbled merrily, exhaling a mouth-watering savor that yet lacked something, leaving a hunger on the palate, a haunting, wistful desire for some lost and needful ingredient. "I came near drowning in that awful river," said Cecilia, shuddering. "It ought to have more water in it," said Hetty. "The stew, I mean. I'll go get some at the sink." "It smells good," said the artist. "That nasty old North River," objected Hetty. "It smells to me like soap factories and wet setter dogs, though." "You mean the stew? Well, I wish we had an onion for it. Did he look like he had money?" "First, he looked kind," said Cecilia. "I'm sure he was rich, but that matters so little. When he drew out his bill folder to pay the cabman, you couldn't help seeing hundreds and thousands of dollars in it. And I looked over the cab doors and saw him leave the ferry station in a motor car. And the chauffeur gave him his bearskin to put on, for he was sopping wet. And it was only 3 days ago." "What a fool," said Hetty, shortly. "Oh, the chauffeur wasn't wet," breathed Cecilia. "And he drove the car away very nicely." "I mean you," said Hetty, "for not giving him your address." "I never give my address to chauffeurs," said Cecilia, haughtily. "I wish we had one," said Hetty, disconsolately. "What for?" "For the stew, of course so. I mean an onion." Hetty took a pitcher and started to the sink at the end of the hall. A young man came down the stairs from above, just as she was opposite the lower step. He was decently dressed, but pale and haggard. His eyes were dull with the stress of some burden of physical or mental woe. In his hand he bore an onion-pink, smooth, solid, shining onion as large around as a 98-cent alarm clock. Hetty stopped. So did the young man. There was something Joan of Arcish, Herculean, and Una-ish in the look and pose of the shoplady. She had cast off the roles of Job and Little Red Riding Hood. The young man stopped at the foot of the stairs and coughed distractedly. He felt marooned, held up, attacked, assailed, levied upon, sacked, assessed, panhandled, browbeaten, though he knew not why. It was the look in Hetty's eyes that did it. In them he saw the Jolly Roger fly to the masthead, and an able seaman with a dirk between his teeth scurry up the ratlins and nail it there. But as yet he did not know that the cargo he carried was the thing that had caused him to be so nearly blown out of the water without even a parley. "Beg your pardon," said Hetty, as sweetly as her dilute acetic acid tones permitted, "but did you find that onion on the stairs? There was a hole in the paper bag, and I've just come out to look for it." The young man coughed for half a minute. The interval may have given him the courage to defend his own property. Also, he clutched his pungent prize greedily, and with a show of spirit, faced his grim waylayer. "No," he said huskily, "I didn't find it on the stairs. It was given to me by Jack Bevins, on the top floor. If you don't believe it, ask him. I'll wait until you do." "I know about Bevins," said Hetty, sourly. "He writes books and things up there for the paper and rags man. We can hear the postman guy him all over the house when he brings them thick envelopes back. Say, do you live in the Vallambrosa?" "I do not," said the young man. "I come to see Bevins sometimes. He's my friend. I live 2 blocks west." "What are you going to do with the onion?" "Begging your pardon," said Hetty. "I'm going to eat it. Raw." "Yes, as soon as I get home." "Haven't you got anything else to eat with it?" The young man considered briefly. "No," he confessed. "There's not another scrap of anything in my diggings to eat. I think old Jack is pretty hard up for grub in his shack, too. He hated to give up the onion, but I worried him into parting with it." "Man," said Hetty, fixing him with her world-sapient eyes, and laying a bony but impressive finger on his sleeve, "you've known trouble too, haven't you?" "Lots," said the onion owner, promptly. "But this onion is my own property, honestly come by. If you will excuse me, I must be going." "Listen," said Hetty, paling a little with anxiety. "Raw onion is a mighty poor diet, and so is a beef stew without one. Now, if you're Jack Bevan's friend, I guess you're nearly right. There's a little lady friend of mine in my room there at the end of the hall. Both of us are out of luck, and we had just potatoes and meat between us. They're stewing now, but it ain't got any soul. There's something lacking to it. There's certain things in life that are naturally intended to fit and belong together. One is pink cheesecloth and green roses, and one is ham and eggs, and one is Irish and trouble, and the other one is beef and potatoes with onions. And still another one is people who are up against it and other people in the same fix. The young man went into a protracted paroxysm of coughing. With one hand, he hugged his onion to his bosom. No doubt, said he at length. But, as I said, I must be going because… Hetty clutched his sleeve firmly. Don't be a dago, little brother. Don't cat raw onions. Chip it in toward the dinner and line yourself inside with the best stew you ever licked a spoon over. Must two ladies knock a young gentleman down and drag him inside for the honor of dining with him? No harm shall befall you, little brother. Loosen up and fall into line. The young man's pale face relaxed into a grin. Believe I'll go you, he said, brightening. If my onion is good as a credential, I'll accept the invitation gladly. It's good as that, but better as seasoning, said Hetty. You come and stand outside the door till I ask my lady friend if she has any objections. And don't run away with that letter of recommendation before I come out. Hetty went into her room and closed the door. The young man waited outside. Cecilia, kid, said the shopgirl, oiling the sharp saw of her voice as well as she could, there's an onion outside, with a young man attached. I've asked him in to dinner. You ain't going to kick, are you? Oh, dear, said Cecilia, sitting up and patting her artistic hair. She cast a mournful glance at the ferryboat poster on the wall. Nit, said Hetty. It ain't him. You're up against real life now. I believe you said your hero friend had money and automobiles. This is a poor skeezix that's got nothing to eat but an onion. But he's easy-spoken and not a freshie. I imagine he's been a gentleman. He's so low down now. And we need the onion. Shall I bring him in? I'll guarantee his behavior. Hetty dear, sighed Cecilia, I'm so hungry. What difference does it make whether he's a prince or a burglar? I don't care. Bring him in if he's got anything to eat with him. Hetty went back into the hall. The onion man was gone. Her heart missed a beat, and a gray look settled over her face except on her nose and cheekbones. And then the tides of life flowed in again, for she saw him leaning out of the front window at the other end of the hall. She hurried there. He was shouting to someone below. The noise of the street overpowered the sound of her footsteps. She looked down over his shoulder, saw whom he was speaking to, and heard his words. He pulled himself in from the windowsill and saw her standing over him. Hetty's eyes bored into him like two steel gimlets. Don't lie to me, she said calmly. What were you going to do with that onion? The young man suppressed a cough and faced her resolutely. His manner was that of one who had been bearded sufficiently. I was going to eat it, said he with emphatic slowness, just as I told you before. And you have nothing else to eat at home? Not a thing. What kind of work do you do? I am not working at anything just now. Then why, said Hetty, with her voice set on its sharpest edge, do you lean out of windows and give orders to chauffeurs in green automobiles in the street below? The young man flushed, and his dull eyes began to sparkle. Because, madam, said he in accelerando tones, I pay the chauffeur's wages and I own the automobile and also this onion, madam. He flourished the onion within an inch of Hetty's nose. The shoplady did not retreat a hair's breadth. Then why do you eat onions, she said, with biting contempt, and nothing else? I never said I did, retorted the young man, heatedly. I said I had nothing else to eat where I live. I am not a delicatessen store keeper. Then why, pursued Hetty, inflexibly, were you going to eat a raw onion? My mother, said the young man, always made me eat one for a cold. Pardon my referring to a physical infirmity, but you may have noticed that I have a very, very severe cold. I was going to eat the onion and go to bed. I wonder why I am standing here and apologizing to you for it. How did you catch this cold? Went on Hetty, suspiciously. The young man seemed to have arrived at some extreme height of feeling. There were two modes of dissent open to him: a burst of rage or a surrender to the ridiculous. He chose wisely, and the empty hall echoed his hoarse laughter. You're a dandy, said he. And I don't blame you for being careful. I don't mind telling you. I got wet. I was on a North River ferry a few days ago when a girl jumped overboard. Of course, Hetty extended her hand, interrupting his story. Give me the onion, she said. The young man set his jaw a trifle harder. Give me the onion, she repeated. He grinned and laid it in her hand. Then Hetty's infrequent, grim, melancholy smile showed itself. She took the young man's arm and pointed with her other hand to the door of her room. Little brother, she said, go in there. The little fool you fished out of the river is there waiting for you. Go on in. I'll give you 3 minutes before I come. Potatoes is in there, waiting. Go on in, onions. After he had tapped at the door and entered, Hetty began to peel and wash the onion at the sink. She gave a gray look at the gray roofs outside, and the smile on her face vanished by little jerks and twitches. But it's us, she said grimly to herself. It's us that furnishes the beef. The Thing's the Play, by O. Henry. Being acquainted with a newspaper reporter who had a couple of free passes, I got to see the performance a few nights ago at one of the popular vaudeville houses. One of the numbers was a violin solo by a striking-looking man not much past 40, but with very gray, thick hair. Not being afflicted with a taste for music, I let the system of noises drift past my ears while I regarded the man. There was a story about that chap a month or two ago, said the reporter. They gave me the assignment. It was to run a column, and was to be on the extremely light and joking order. The old man seems to like the funny touch I give to local happenings. Oh yes, I'm working on a farce comedy now. Well, I went down to the house and got all the details, but I certainly fell down on that job. I went back and turned in a comic write-up of an East Side funeral instead. Why? Oh, I couldn't seem to get hold of it with my funny hooks, somehow. Maybe you could make a one-act tragedy out of it for a curtain raiser. I'll give you the details. After the performance, my friend, the reporter, recited to me the facts over the Risburger. I see no reason, said I, when he had concluded, why that shouldn't make a rattling good funny story. Those 3 people couldn't have acted in a more absurd and preposterous manner if they had been real actors in a real theater. I'm really afraid that all the stage is a world, anyhow, and all the players men and women. The Thing's the Play is the way I quote Mr. Shakespeare. Try it, said the reporter. I will, said I, and I did, to show him how he could have made a humorous column of it for his paper. There stands a house near Abingdon Square. On the ground floor there has been for 25 years a little store where toys and notions and stationery are sold. One night 20 years ago there was a wedding in the rooms above the store. The widow Mayo owned the house and store. Her daughter Helen was married to Frank Barry. John Delaney was best man. Helen was 18, and her picture had been printed in a morning paper next to the headlines of a wholesale female murderess story from Butte, Montana. But after your eye and intelligence had rejected the connection, you seized your magnifying glass and read beneath the portrait her description as one of a series of prominent beauties and belles of the Lower West Side. Frank Barry and John Delaney were prominent young beaux of the same side and bosom friends, whom you expected to turn upon each other every time the curtain went up. One who pays his money for orchestra seats in fiction expects this. That is the first funny idea that has turned up in the story yet. Both had made a great race for Helen's hand. When Frank won, John shook his hand and congratulated him honestly. He did. After the ceremony, Helen ran upstairs to put on her hat. She was getting married in a traveling dress. She and Frank were going to Old Point Comfort for a week. Downstairs, the usual horde of gibbering cave dwellers were waiting with their hands full of old Congress gaiters and paper bags of hominy. Then there was a rattle of the fire escape, and into her room jumps the mad and infatuated John Delaney, with a damp curl drooping upon his forehead, and made violent and reprehensible love to his lost one, entreating her to flee or fly with him to the Riviera or the Bronx, or any old place where there are Italian skies and Arne. It would have carried Blaney off his feet to see Helen repulse him. With blazing and scornful eyes, she fairly withered him by demanding whatever he meant by speaking to respectable people that way. In a few moments she had him going. The manliness that had possessed him departed. He bowed low, and said something about irresistible impulse and forever carry in his heart the memory of, and she suggested that he catch the first fire escape going down. "I will away," said John Delaney, "to the furthermost parts of the earth. I cannot remain near you and know that you are another's. I will to Africa, and there amid other scenes strive to for." "For goodness sake, get out," said Helen. "Somebody might come in." He knelt upon one knee, and she extended him one white hand that he might give it a farewell kiss. Girls, was this choice boon of the great little god Cupid ever vouchsafed you to have the fellow you want hard and fast, and have the one you don't want come with a damp curl on his forehead and kneel to you and babble of Africa and love which, in spite of everything, shall forever bloom, an amaranth in his heart? To know your power, and to feel the sweet security of your own happy state, to send the unlucky one, broken-hearted, to foreign climes, while you congratulate yourself as he presses his last kiss upon your knuckles, that your nails are well manicured, say, girls, it's voluptuous, don't ever let it get by you. And then, of course, how did you guess it? The door opened and in stalked the bridegroom, jealous of slow-tying bonnet strings. The farewell kiss was imprinted upon Helen's hand, and out of the window and down the fire escape sprang John Delaney, Africa bound. A little slow music, if you please, faint violin, just a breath in the clarinet and a touch of the cello. Imagine the scene, frank, white-hot, with the cry of a man wounded to death bursting from him. Helen, rushing and clinging to him, trying to explain. He catches her wrists and tears them from his shoulders. Twice, thrice he sways her this way and that, the stage manager will show you how, and throws her from him to the floor, a huddled, crushed, moaning thing. Never, he cries, will he look upon her face again, and rushes from the house through the staring groups of astonished guests. And, now because it is the thing instead of the play, the audience must stroll out into the real lobby of the world and marry, die, grow gray, rich, poor, happy or sad during the intermission of 20 years which must precede the rising of the curtain again. Mrs. Barry inherited the shop and the house. At 38, she could have bested many an 18-year-old at a beauty show on points and general results. Only a few people remembered her wedding comedy, but she made of it no secret. She did not pack it in lavender or mothballs, nor did she sell it to a magazine. One day, a middle-aged money-making lawyer, who bought his legal cap and ink of her, asked her across the counter to marry him. "I'm really much obliged to you," said Helen, cheerfully, "but I married another man 20 years ago. He was more a goose than a man, but I think I love him yet. I have never seen him since about half an hour after the ceremony. Was it copying ink that you wanted, or just writing fluid?" The lawyer bowed over the counter with old-time grace and left a respectful kiss on the back of her hand. Helen sighed. Parting salutes, however romantic, may be overdone. Here she was at 38, beautiful and admired, and all that she seemed to have got from her lovers were approaches and adieus. Worse still, in the last one she had lost a customer, too. Business languished, and she hung out a room to let card. 2 large rooms on the 3rd floor were prepared for desirable tenants. Rumors came and went regretfully, for the house of Mrs. Barry was the abode of neatness, comfort, and taste. One day came Ramonti, the violinist, and engaged the front room above. The discord and clatter uptown offended his nice ear. So a friend had sent him to this oasis in the desert of noise. Ramonti, with his still youthful face, his dark eyebrows, his short, pointed, foreign, brown beard, his distinguished head of gray hair, and his artist's temperament revealed in his light, gay, and sympathetic manner, was a welcome tenant in the old house near Abingdon Square. Helen lived on the floor above the store. The architecture of it was singular and quaint. The hall was large and almost square. Up one side of it, and then across the end of it ascended an open stairway to the floor above. This hall space she had furnished as a sitting room and office combined. There she kept her desk and wrote her business letters, and there she sat of evenings by a warm fire and a bright red light and sewed or read. Ramonti found the atmosphere so agreeable that he spent much time there, describing to Mrs. Barry the wonders of Paris, where he had studied with a particularly notorious and noisy fiddler. Next comes lodger number 2, a handsome, melancholy man in the early 40s, with a brown, mysterious beard and strangely pleading, haunting eyes. He, too, found the society of Helen a desirable thing. With the eyes of Romeo and Othello's tongue, he charmed her with tales of distant climes and wooed her by respectful innuendo. From the first, Helen felt a marvelous and compelling thrill in the presence of this man. His voice somehow took her swiftly back to the days of her youth's romance. This feeling grew, and she gave way to it, and it led her to an instinctive belief that he had been a factor in that romance. And then with a woman's reasoning, oh, yes, they do, sometimes. She leaped over common syllogisms and theory and logic, and was sure that her husband had come back to her. For she saw in his eyes love, which no woman can mistake, and 1,000 tons of regret and remorse, which aroused pity, which is perilously near to love requited, which is the unearthly in the house that Jack built. But she made no sign. A husband who steps around the corner for 20 years and then drops in again should not expect to find his slippers laid out too conveniently near, nor a match ready lighted for his cigar. There must be expiation, explanation, and possibly execration. A little purgatory, and then, maybe, if he were properly humble, he might be trusted with a harp and crown. And so she made no sign that she knew or suspected. And my friend, the reporter, could see nothing funny in this, sent out on an assignment to write up a roaring, hilarious, brilliant joshing story of, but I will not knock a brother, let us go on with the story. One evening Ramonti stopped in Helen's hall office reception room and told his love with the tenderness and ardor of the enraptured artist. His words were a bright flame of the divine fire that glows in the heart of a man who is a dreamer and doer combined. But before you give me an answer, he went on, before she could accuse him of suddenness, I must tell you that Ramonti is the only name I have to offer you. My manager gave me that. I do not know who I am or where I came from. My first recollection is of opening my eyes in a hospital. I was a young man, and I had been there for weeks. My life before that is a blank to me. They told me that I was found lying in the street with a wound on my head and was brought there in an ambulance. They thought I must have fallen and struck my head upon the stones. There was nothing to show who I was. I have never been able to remember. After I was discharged from the hospital, I took up the violin. I have had success. Mrs. Barry, I do not know your name except that I love you. The first time I saw you, I realized that you were the one woman in the world for me. Oh, a lot of stuff like that. Helen felt young again. First a wave of pride and a sweet little thrill of vanity went all over her. And then she looked Ramonti in the eyes, and a tremendous throb went through her heart. She hadn't expected that throb. It took her by surprise. The musician had become a big factor in her life, and she hadn't been aware of it. Mr. Ramonti, she said sorrowfully, this was not on the stage, remember. It was in the old home near Abingdon Square. I'm awfully sorry, but I'm a married woman. And then she told him the sad story of her life, as a heroine must do, sooner or later, either to a theatrical manager or to a reporter. Ramonti took her hand, bowed low and kissed it, and went up to his room. Helen sat down and looked mournfully at her hand. Well, she might. 3 suitors had kissed it, mounted their red-roan steeds and ridden away. In an hour entered the mysterious stranger with the haunting eyes. Helen was in the willow rocker, knitting a useless thing in cotton wool. He ricocheted from the stairs and stopped for a chat. Sitting across the table from her, he also poured out his narrative of love. And then he said, Helen, do you not remember me? I think I have seen it in your eyes. Can you forgive the past and remember the love that has lasted for 20 years? I wronged you deeply. I was afraid to come back to you, but my love overpowered my reason. Can you, will you, forgive me? Helen stood up. The mysterious stranger held one of her hands in a strong and trembling clasp. There she stood, and I pity the stage that it has not acquired a scene like that and her emotions to portray. For she stood with a divided heart. The fresh, unforgettable, virginal love for her bridegroom was hers. The treasured, sacred, honored memory of her first choice filled half her soul. She leaned to that pure feeling. Honor and faith and sweet, abiding romance bound her to it. But the other half of her heart and soul was filled with something else, a later, fuller, nearer influence. And so the old fought against the new. And while she hesitated, from the room above came the soft, racking, petitionary music of a violin. The hag, music, bewitches some of the noblest. The daws may peck upon one's sleeve without injury, but whoever wears his heart upon his tympanum gets it not far from the neck. This music and the musician collar her, and at her side honor and the old love held her back. "Forgive me," he pleaded. 20 years is a long time to remain away from the one you say you love," she declared, with a purgatorial touch. "How could I tell?" he begged. "I will conceal nothing from you." That night when he left, I followed him. I was mad with jealousy. On a dark street, I struck him down. He did not rise. I examined him. His head had struck a stone. I did not intend to kill him. I was mad with love and jealousy. I hid nearby and saw an ambulance take him away. "Although you married him, Helen." "Sir, who are you?" Cried the woman, with wide open eyes, snatching her hand away. "Don't you remember me? Helen, the one who has always loved you best? I am John Delaney. If you can forgive." But she was gone, leaping, stumbling, hurrying, flying up the stairs toward the music and him who had forgotten, but who had known her for his in each of his two existences, and as she climbed up she sobbed, cried, and sang, "Frank, Frank, Frank." Three mortals thus juggling with years as though they were billiard balls, and my friend, the reporter, couldn't see anything funny in it. The Theory and the Hound, by O. Henry. Not many days ago, my old friend from the tropics, J. P. Bridger, United States Consul on the island of Ratona, was in the city. We had wassail and jubilee and saw the Flatiron Building, and missed seeing the Bronxless Menagerie by about a couple of nights. And then, at the ebb tide, we were walking up a street that parallels and parodies Broadway. A woman with a comely and mundane countenance passed us, holding in leash a wheezing, vicious, waddling brute of a yellow pug. The dog entangled himself with Bridger's legs and mumbled his ankles in a snarling, peevish, sulky bite. Bridger, with a happy smile, kicked the breath out of the brute. The woman showered us with a quick rain of well-conceived adjectives that left us in no doubt as to our place in her opinion, and we passed on. 10 yards farther, an old woman with disordered white hair and her bank book tucked well hidden beneath her tattered shawl begged. Bridger stopped and disinterred for her a quarter from his holiday waist coat. On the next corner, a quarter of a ton of well-clothed man with a rice-powdered, fat, white jowl stood holding the chain of a devil-born bulldog whose forelegs were strangers by the length of a dachshund. A little woman in a last season's hat confronted him and wept, which was plainly all she could do, while he cursed her in low, sweet, practiced tones. Bridger smiled again, strictly to himself, and this time he took out a little memorandum book and made a note of it. This he had no right to do without due explanation, and I said so. "It's a new theory," said Bridger, "that I picked up down in Ratona. I've been gathering support for it as I knock about. The world isn't ripe for it yet, but, well, I'll tell you. And then you run your mind back along the people you've known and see what you make of it." And so I cornered Bridger in a place where they have artificial palms and wine. And he told me the story which is here in my words and on his responsibility. One afternoon at 3 o'clock, on the island of Ratona, a boy raced along the beach screaming, "Pajaro, ahoy!" Thus he made known the keenness of his hearing and the justice of his discrimination in pitch. He who first heard and made oral proclamation concerning the toot of an approaching steamer's whistle, and correctly named the steamer, was a small hero in Ratona, until the next steamer came. Wherefore, there was rivalry among the barefoot youth of Ratona, and many fell victims to the softly blown conch shells of sloops, which, as they enter harbor, sound surprisingly like a distant steamer's signal. And some could name you the vessel when its call, in your duller ears, sounded no louder than the sigh of the wind through the branches of the cocoa nut palms. But today he who proclaimed the Pajaro gained his honors. Ratona bent its ear to listen, and soon the deep-tongued blast grew louder and nearer, and at length Ratona saw above the line of palms on the low joint the two black funnels of the fruiter slowly creeping toward the mouth of the harbor. You must know that Ratona is an island 20 miles off the south of a South American republic. It is a port of that republic, and it sleeps sweetly in a smiling sea, toiling not nor spinning, fed by the abundant tropics where all things ripen, cease, and fall toward the grave. 800 people dream life away in a green, embowered village that follows the horseshoe curve of its bijou harbor. They are mostly Spanish and Indian mestizos, with a shading of San Domingo Negroes, a lightening of pure-blood Spanish officials, and a slight leavening of the froth of 3 or 4 pioneering white races. No steamers touch at Ratona save the fruit steamers which take on their banana inspectors there on their way to the coast. They leave Sunday newspapers, ice, quinine, bacon, watermelons, and vaccine matter at the island, and that is about all the touch Ratona gets with the world. The Pajaro paused at the mouth of the harbor, rolling heavily in the swell that sent the whitecaps racing beyond the smooth water inside. Already 2 dories from the village, one conveying fruit inspectors, the other going for what it could get, were halfway out to the steamer. The inspector's dory was taken on board with them, and the Pajaro steamed away for the mainland for its load of fruit. The other boat returned to Ratona bearing a contrary, battalion from the Pajaro's store of ice, the usual roll of newspapers, and 1 passenger, Taylor Plunkett, Sheriff of Chatham County, Kentucky. Bridger, the United States consul at Ratona, was clean, aimed his rifle in the official shanty under a breadfruit tree 20 yards from the water of the harbor. The consul occupied a place somewhat near the tail of his political party's procession. The music of the bandwagon sounded very faintly to him in the distance. The plums of office went to others. Bridger's share of the spoils, the consulship at Ratona, was little more than a prune, a dried prune from the boarding house department of the public crib. But $900 yearly was opulence in Ratona. Besides, Bridger had contracted a passion for shooting alligators in the lagoons near his consulate, and was not unhappy. He looked up from a careful inspection of his rifle lock, a broad man filling his doorway. A broad, noiseless, slow-moving man, sunburned almost to the Van Dyke. A man of 45, neatly clothed in homespun, with scanty light hair, a close-clipped brown, and gray beard and pale blue eyes expressing mildness simplicity. "You are Mr. Bridger, the consul," said the broad man. "They directed me here. Can you tell me what those big bunches of things like gourds are in those trees that look like feather dusters along the edge of the water?" "Take that chair," said the consul, re-oiling his clean, ingy rag. "No, the other one. That bamboo thing won't hold you." "Why, they're coconuts, green coconuts. The shell of 'em is always a light green before they're ripe." "Much obliged," said the other man, sitting down carefully. "I didn't quite like to tell the folks at home they were olives unless I was sure about it. My name is Plunkett. I'm sheriff of Chatham County, Kentucky. I've got extradition papers in my pocket authorizing the arrest of a man on this island. They've been signed by the president of this country, and they're in correct shape. The man's name is Wade Williams. He's in the cocoa, nut-raising business. What he's wanted for is the murder of his wife 2 years ago. Where can I find him?" The consul squinted an eye and looked through his rifle barrel. "There's nobody on the island who calls himself Will Liams," he remarked. "Didn't suppose there was," said Plunkett mildly. "He'll do by any other name." "Besides myself," said Bridger, "there are only 2 Americans on Ratona, Bob Reeves and Henry Morgan." "The man I want sells coconuts," suggested Plunkett. "You see that coconut walk extending up to the point?" said the consul, waving his hand toward the open door. "That belongs to Bob Reeves. Henry Morgan owns half the trees to Luard on the island." "1 month ago," said the sheriff, "Wade Williams wrote a confidential letter to a man in Chatham County, telling him where he was and how he was getting along. The letter was lost, and the person that found it gave it away. They sent me after him, and I've got the papers. I reckon he's one of your coconut men for certain." "You've got his picture, of course," said Bridger. "It might be Reeves or Morgan, but I'd hate to think it. They're both as fine fellows as you'd meet in an all-day auto ride." "No," doubtfully answered Plunkett. "There wasn't any picture of Williams to be had, and I never saw him myself. I've been sheriff only a year, but I've got a pretty accurate description of him. About 5 feet 11, dark hair and eyes, nose inclined to be Roman, heavy about the shoulders, strong, white teeth, with none miss, ing. laughs a good deal, talkative, drinks considerably but never to intoxication, looks you square in the eye when talking, age 35. Which one of your men does that description fit? The consul grinned broadly. I'll tell you what you do, he said, laying down his rifle and slipping on his dingy black alpaca coat. You come along, Mr. Plunkett, and I'll take you up to see the boys. If you can tell which one of 'em you're to script, tie-in fits better than it does the other you have the advantage of me. Bridger conducted the sheriff out and along the hard beach close to which the tiny houses of the village were distributed. Immediately back of the town rose sudden, small, thickly wooded hills. Up one of these, by means of steps cut in the hard clay, the consul led Plunkett. The very verge of an eminence was perched, a two-room wooden cottage with a thatched roof. A Carib woman was washing clothes outside. The consul ushered the sheriff to the door of the room that overlooked the harbor. Two men were in the room, about to sit down, in their shirt sleeves, to a table spread for dinner. They bore little resemblance one to the other in detail, but the general description given by Plunkett could have been justly applied to either. In height, color of hair, shape of nose, build and manners each of them tallied with it. They were fair types of jovial, ready-witted, broad, gauged Americans who had gravitated together for companionship in an alien land. "Hello, Bridger," they called in unison at sight of the consul. "Come and have dinner with us." And then they noticed Plunkett at his heels, and came forward with hospitable curiosity. "Gentlemen," said the consul, his voice taking on unaccustomed formality, "this is Mr. Plunkett, Mr. Reeves, and Mr. Morgan." The coconut barons greeted the newcomer joyously. Reeves seemed about an inch taller than Morgan, but his laugh was not quite as loud. Morgan's eyes were deep brown. Reeves's were black. Reeves was the host and busied himself with fetching other chairs and calling to the Carib woman for supplemental tableware. It was explained that Morgan lived in a bamboo shack to leeward, but that every day the two friends dined together. Plunkett stood still during the preparations, looking about mildly with his pale blue eyes. Bridger looked apologetic and uneasy. At length 2 other covers were laid and the company was assigned to places. Reeves and Morgan stood side by side across the table from the visitors. Reeves nodded genially as a signal for all to seat themselves. And then suddenly Plunkett raised his hand with a gesture of authority. He was looking straight between Reeves and Morgan. "Wade Williams," he said quietly, "you are under arrest for murder." Reeves and Morgan instantly exchanged a quick, bright glance, the quality of which was interrogation, with a seasoning of surprise. Then, simultaneously they turned to the speaker with a puzzled and frank cat-eyen in their gaze. "Can't say that we understand you, Mr. Plunkett," said Morgan, cheerfully. "Did you say Williams?" "What's the joke, Bridgie?" asked Reeves, turning to the consul with a smile. Before Bridger could answer, Plunkett spoke again. "I'll explain," he said quietly. "One of you don't need any explanation, but this is for the other one. One of you is Wade Williams of Chatham County, Kentucky. You murdered your wife on May 5th, 2 years ago, after ill-treating and abusing her continually for 5 years. I have the proper papers in my pocket for taking you back with me, and you are going. We will return on the fruit steamer that comes back by this island tomorrow to leave its inspectors. I acknowledge, gentlemen, that I'm not quite sure which one of you is Williams. But Wade Williams goes back to Chatham County tomorrow. I want you to understand that." A great sound of merry laughter from Morgan and Reeves went out over the still harbor. 2 or 3 fishermen in the fleet of sloops anchored there looked up at the house of the Diablos Americanos on the hill and wondered. "My dear Mr. Plunkett," cried Morgan, conquering his mirth, "the dinner is getting cold. Let us sit down and eat. I am anxious to get my spoon into that shark fin soup. Business afterward." "Sit down, gentlemen, if you please," added Reeves pleasantly. "I am sure Mr. Plunkett will not object. Perhaps a little time may be of advantage to him in identifying the gentleman he wishes to arrest." "No objections, I'm sure," said Plunkett, dropping into his chair heavily. "I'm hungry myself. I didn't want to accept the hospitality of you folks without giving you notice, that's all." Reeves set bottles and glasses on the table. "There's cognac," he said, an anisada, and Scotch smoke, and rye. Take your choice. Bridger chose rye. Reeves poured 3 fingers of Scotch for himself. Morgan took the same. The sheriff, against much protestation, filled his glass from the water bottle. "Here's to the appetite," said Reeves, raising his glass, "of Mr. Williams." Morgan's laugh and his drink encountering sent him into a choking splutter. All began to pay attention to the dinner, which was well cooked and palatable. "Williams!" called Plunkett, suddenly and sharply. All looked up wonderingly. Reeves found the sheriff's mild eye resting upon him. He flushed a little. "See here," he said, with some asperity, "my name's Reeves, and I don't want you to." But the comedy of the thing came to his rescue, and he ended with a laugh. "I suppose, Mr. Plunkett," said Morgan, carefully seasoning an alligator pear, "that you are aware of the fact that you will import a good deal of trouble for yourself into Kentucky if you take back the wrong man. That is, of course, if you take anybody back?" "Thank you for the salt," said the sheriff. "Oh, I'll take somebody back. It'll be one of you 2 gentlemen. Yes, I know I'd get stuck for damages if I make a mistake, but I'm going to try to get the right man." "I'll tell you what you do," said Morgan, leaning forward with a jolly twinkle in his eyes. "You take me. I'll go without any trouble. The coconut business hasn't panned out well this year, and I'd like to make some extra money out of your bondsman." "That's not fair," chimed in Reeves. "I got only $16 1,000 for my last shipment. Take me, Mr. Plunkett." "I'll take Wade Williams," said the sheriff, patiently, "or I'll come pretty close to it." "It's like dining with a ghost," remarked Morgan, with a pretended shiver. "The ghost of a murderer, too. Will somebody pass the toothpicks to the shade of the naughty Mr. Williams?" Plunkett seemed as unconcerned as if he were dining at his own table in Chatham County. He was a gallant trencherman, and the strange tropic viands tickled his palate. Heavy, commonplace, almost slothful in his movements, he appeared to be devoid of all the cunning and watchfulness of the sleuth. He even ceased to observe, with any sharpness or attempted discrimination, the 2 men, one of whom he had undertaken with surprising self-confidence to drag away upon the serious charge of wife murder. Here, indeed, was a problem set before him that if wrongly solved would have amounted to his serious discomfiture. Yet there he sat puzzling his soul, to all appearances, over the novel flavor of a broiled iguana cutlet. The consul felt a decided discomfort. Reeves and Morgan were his friends and pals, yet the sheriff from Kentucky had a certain right to his official aid and moral support. So Bridger sat the silentest around the board and tried to estimate the peculiar situation. His conclusion was that both Reeves and Morgan, quick-witted, as he knew them to be, had conceived at the moment of Plunkett's disclosure of his mission, and in the brief space of a lightning flash, the idea that the other might be the guilty Williams, and that each of them had decided in that moment loyally to protect his comrade against the doom that threatened him. This was the consul's theory, and if he had been a bookmaker at a race of wits for life and liberty, he would have offered heavy odds against the plotting sheriff from Chatham County, Kentucky. When the meal was concluded, the Carib woman came and removed the dishes and cloth. Reeves strewed them table with excellent cigars, and Plunkett, with the others, lighted one of these with evident gratification. "I may be dull," said Morgan, with a grin and a wink at Bridger, "but I want to know if I am. Now, I say this is all a joke of Mr. Plunkett's, concocted to frighten 2 babes in the woods. Is this Williamson to be taken seriously or not?" "Williams," corrected Plunkett gravely. "I never got off any jokes in my life. I know I wouldn't travel 2,000 miles to get off a poor one as this would be if I didn't take Wade Williams back with me. Gentlemen," continued the sheriff, now letting his mild eyes travel impartially from one of the company to another, "see if you can find any joke in this case. Wade Williams is listening to the words I utter now, but out of politeness, I will speak of him as a third person. For 5 years he made his wife lead the life of a dog. No, I'll take that back. No dog in Kentucky was ever treated as she was. He spent the money that she brought him, spent it at races, at the card table and on horses and hunting. He was a good fellow to his friends, but a cold, sullen demon at home. He wound up the 5 years of neglect by strict on her with his closed hand, a hand as hard as a stone, when she was ill and weak from suffering. She died the next day, and he skipped. That's all there is to it. It's enough. I never saw Williams, but I knew his wife. I'm not a man to tell half. She and I were ing company when she met him. She went to Louisville on a visit and saw him there. I'll admit that he spoilt my chances in no time. I lived then on the edge of the Cumberland Mountains. I was elected sheriff of Chatham County a year after Wade Williams killed his wife. My official duty sends me out here after him, but I'll admit that there's personal feeling too. And he's going back with me. Mr. Reeves, will you pass me a match? Awfully imprudent of Williams, said Morgan, putting his feet up against the wall. To strike a Kentucky lady. Seems to me I've heard they were scrappers. Bad Williams, said Reeves, pouring out more scotch. The two men spoke lightly, but the consul saw and felt the tension and the carefulness in their actions and words. Good old fellows, he said to himself. They're both all right. Each of them is standing by the other like a little brick church. And then a dog walked into the room where they sat. A black and tan hound, long-eared, lazy, confident of welcome. Plunkett turned his head and looked at the animal, which halted, confidently, within a few feet of his chair. Suddenly the sheriff, with a deep-mouthed oath, left his seat and bestowed upon the dog a vicious and heavy kick with his ponderous shoe. The hound, heartbroken, astonished, with flapping ears and incurved tail, uttered a piercing yelp of pain and surprise. Reeves and the consul remained in their chairs, saying nothing, but astonished at the unexpected show of intolerance from the easy-going man from Chatham County. But Morgan, with a suddenly purpling face, leaped to his feet and raised a threatening arm above the guest. "You brute!" he shouted, passionately. "Why did you do that?" Quickly the amenities returned. Plunkett muttered some indistinct apology and regained his seat. Morgan, with a decided effort, controlled his indignation and also returned to his chair. And then Plunkett, with the spring of a tiger, leaped around the corner of the table and snapped handcuffs on the paralyzed Morgan's wrists. "Hound lover and woman killer," he cried. "Get ready to meet your God." When Bridger had finished, I asked him, "Did he get the right man?" "He did," said the consul. "And how did he know?" I inquired, being in a kind of bewilderment. "When he put Morgan in the dory," answered Bridger. "The next day to take him aboard the Pajero, this man Plunkett stopped to shake hands with me, and I asked him the same question. 'Mr. Bridger,' said he, 'I'm a Kentuckian, and I've seen a great deal of both men and animals. And I never yet saw a man that was overfond of horses and dogs, but what was cruel to women.' The Tale of a Tainted Tinner, by O. Henry. Money talks. But you may think that the conversation of a little old $10 bill in New York would be nothing more than a whisper. Oh, very well. Pass up this _sotto voce autobiography of an ex if you like. If you are one of the kind that prefers to listen to John Dee's checkbook roar at you through a megaphone as it passes by, all right. But don't forget that small change can say a word to the point now and then. The next time you tip your grocer's clerk a silver quarter to give you extra weight of his boss's goods, read the 4 words above the lady's head. How are they for repartee? I am a $10 treasury note, series of 1901. You may have seen one in a friend's hand. On my face, in the center, is a picture of the bison americanus, miscalled a buffalo by 50 or 60 millions of Americans. The heads of Captain Lewis and Captain Clark adorn the ends. On my back is the graceful figure of Liberty or Ceres or Maxine Elliot standing in the center of the stage on a conservatory plant. My references is or are section 3588, revised statutes. 10 cold, hard dollars. I don't say whether silver, gold, lead or iron. Uncle Sam will hand you over his counter if you want to cash me in. I beg you will excuse any conversational breaks that I make, thanks. I knew you would got that sneaking little respect and agreeable feeling toward even an ex, haven't you? You see, a tainted bill doesn't have much chance to acquire a correct form of expression. I never knew a really cultured and educated person that could afford to hold a tin spot any longer than it would take to do an Arthur Duffy to the nearest that's all sign or delicatessen store. For a 6-year-old, I've had a lively and gorgeous circulation. I guess I've paid as many debts as the man who dies. I've been owned by a good many kinds of people, but a little old ragged, damp, dingy $5 silver certificate gave me a jar one day. I was next to it in the fat and bad-smelling purse of a butcher. "Hey, you sitting bull," says I, "don't Scrooge so. Anyhow, don't you think it's about time you went in on a customs payment and got reissued? For a series of 18.99 you're a sight." "Oh, don't get crackly just because you're a Buffalo Bill," says the fiver. "You'd be limp too, if you'd been stuffed down in a thick cotton and lisle thread under an elastic all day, and the thermometer not a degree under 85 in the store." "I never heard of a pocketbook like that," says I. "Who carried you?" "A shop girl," says the five-spot. "What's that?" I had to ask. "You'll never know till their millennium comes," says the fiver. Just then a $2 bill behind me with a George Washington head spoke up to the fiver. Cut out your kicks. Ain't lisle thread good enough for you? If you was under all cotton like I've been today, and choked up with factory dust till the lady with the cornucopia on me sneezed half a dozen times, you'd have some reason to complain." That was the next day after I arrived in New York. I came in a $500 package of tins to a Brooklyn bank from one of its Pennsylvania correspondents, and I haven't made the acquaintance of any of the 5 and 2 spots friends' pocketbooks yet. Silk for mine, every time. I was lucky money. I kept on the move. Sometimes I changed hands 20 times a day. I saw the inside of every business. I fought for my owners every pleasure. It seemed that on Saturday nights I never missed being slapped down on a bar. Tens were always slapped down, while 1s and 2s were slid over to the bartenders folded. I got in the habit of looking for mine, and I managed to soak in a little straight or some spilled martini or Manhattan whenever I could. Once I got tied up in a great greasy roll of bills in a pushcart peddler's jeans. I thought I never would get in circulation again, for the future department store owner lived on 8 cents worth of dog meat and onions a day. But this peddler got into trouble one day on account of having his cart too near a crossing, and I was rescued. I always will feel grateful to the cop that got me. He changed me at a cigar store near the Bowery that was running a crap game in the back room. So it was the captain of the precinct, after all, that did me the best turn. When he got his, he blew me for wine the next evening in a Broadway restaurant, and I really felt as glad to get back again as an Astor does when he sees the lights of Charing Cross. A tainted tin certainly does get action on Broadway. I was alimony once, and got folded in a little dogskin purse among a lot of dimes. They were bragging about the busy times there were in Ossining whenever 3 girls got hold of one of them during the ice cream season. But its slow-moving vehicles keep to the right for the little bok tips when you think of the way we bison plasters refuse to stick to anything during the rush lobster hour. The first I ever heard of tainted money was one night when a good thing with a van to his name threw me over with some other bills to buy a stack of blues. About midnight a big, easygoing man with a fat face like a monk's and the eye of a janitor with his wages raised took me and a lot of other notes and rolled us into what is termed a wad among the money tainters. "Ticket me for 500, said he to the banker, "and look out for everything, Charlie. I'm going out for a stroll in the glen before the moonlight fades from the brow of the cliff. If anybody finds the roof in their way, there's $60,000 wrapped in a comic supplement in the upper left-hand corner of the safe. Be bold. Everywhere be bold, but be not bowled over." Night. I found myself between 2 $20 gold certificates. One of them says to me, "Well, old Shorthorn, you're in luck tonight. You'll see something of life. Old Jack's going to make the tenderloin look like a Hamburg steak." "Explain," says I. "I'm used to joints, but I don't care for filet mignon with the kind of sauce you serve." "'Scuse me," said the 20. "Old Jack is the proprietor of this gambling house. He's going on a whiz tonight because he offered $50,000 to a church, and it refused to accept it because they said his money was tainted." "What is a church?" I asked. "Oh, I forgot," says the 20, "that I was talking to a tinner. Of course you don't know. You're too much to put into the contribution basket and not enough to buy anything at a bazaar. A church is a large building in which pen wipers and tidies are sold at $20 each. I don't care much about chinning with gold certificates. There's a streak of yellow in M. All is not gold that's quitters. Old Jack certainly was a gild-edged sport. When it came his time to loosen up, he never referred the waiter to an actuary. By and by it got around that he was smiting the rock in the wilderness, and all along Broadway things with cold noses and hot gullets fell in on our trail. The third Jungle Book was there waiting for somebody to put covers on it. Old Jack's money may have had a taint to it, but all the same he had orders for his camembert piling up on him every minute. First his friends rallied round him, and then the fellows that his friends knew by sight, and then a few of his enemies buried the hatchet, and finally he was buying souvenirs for so many Neapolitan fisher maidens and butterfly octettes that the head waiters were phoning all over town for Julie and Mitchell to please come around and get them into some kind of order. At last we floated into an uptown cafe that I knew by heart. When the Hod Carriers Union in jackets and aprons saw us coming, the chief goal kicker called out 6-11-42-19-12 to his men, and they put on nose guards till it was clear whether we meant Port Arthur or Portsmouth. But old Jack wasn't working for the furniture and glass factories that night. He sat down quiet and sang Ramble in a half-hearted way. His feelings had been hurt, so the 20 told me, because his offer to the church had been refused. But the wassail went on, and Brady himself couldn't have hammered the thirst mob into a better imitation of the real penchant for the stuff that you screw out of a bottle with a napkin. Old Jack paid the 20 above me for a round, leaving me on the outside of his roll. He laid the roll on the table and sent for the proprietor. "Mike," says he, "here's money that the good people have refused. Will it buy of your wares in the name of the devil? They say it's tainted." "I will," says Mike, "and I'll put it in the drawer next to the bills that was paid to the parson's daughter for kisses at the church fair to build a new parsonage for the parson's daughter to live in." At 1 o'clock, when the Hod Carriers were making ready to close up the front and keep the inside open, a woman slips in the door of the restaurant and comes up to old Jack's table. You've seen the kind black shawl, creepy hair, ragged skirt, white face, eyes a cross between Gabriel's and a sick kitten's, the kind of woman that's always on the lookout for an automobile or the mendicancy squad. As she stands there without a word and looks at the money, old Jack gets up, peels me off the roll, and hands me to her with a bow. "Madam," says he, "just like actors I've heard, here is a tainted bill. I am a gambler. This bill came to me tonight from a gentleman's son. Where he got it I do not know. If you will do me the favor to accept it, it is yours." The woman took me with a trembling hand. "Sir," said she, "I counted thousands of this issue of bills into packages when they were virgin from the presses. I was a clerk in the Treasury Department. There was an official to whom I owed my position. You say they are tainted now. If you only knew, but I won't say any more. Thank you with all my heart. Sir, thank you, thank you." Where do you suppose that woman carried me almost at a run? To a bakery. Away from old Jack and a sizzling good time to a bakery. And I get changed, and she does a Sheridan 20 miles away with a dozen rolls and a section of jelly cake as big as a turbine water wheel. Of course I lost sight of her then, for I was snowed up in the bakery, wondering whether I'd get changed at the drug store the next day in an alum deal or paid over to the cement works. A week afterward, I butted up against one of the $1 bills the baker had given the woman for change. "Hello, E35039-669, says I. "Weren't you in the change for me in a bakery last Saturday night?" "Yep," says the solitaire in his free and easy style. "How did the deal turn out?" I asked. "She blew E170-51431 for Mills and round steak," says the one spot. "She kept me till the rent man came. It was a bum room with a sick kid in it. But you ought to have seen him go for the bread and tincture of formaldehyde. Half-starved, I guess. Then she prayed some. Don't get stuck up, tenor. We one spots hear 10 prayers, where you hear one. She said something about, who giveth to the poor. Oh, let's cut out the slum talk. I'm certainly tired of the company that keeps me. I wish I was big enough to move in society with you tainted bills." "Shut up," says I. "There's no such thing. I know the rest of it. There's a lendeth to the Lord somewhere in it. Now look on my back and read what you see there. This note is a legal tender at its face value for all debts public and private. This talk about tainted money makes me tired," says I.